Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lizzie Wyant, and I am the Deputy Executive Director for Public Affairs and Advocacy at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And you are all joining us today because you want to know as much as we do about the final rule on the American Rescue Plan Act. We are joined today by Brendan Sweeney, the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs at ANF Federal Funds Office, who is going to be going through a detailed presentation about what the final rule says and its impact on cities and towns. And I promise that we will be sending Brendan's slides out after the presentation today. So anyone who wants to reread them will have a chance to do so. We are also recording this presentation, so you're welcome to send it to all of your friends and family who are super interested in ARPA. Talking about some of the funding decision processes that Chelsea has gone through in thinking through their ARPA funding decisions. We are very excited to have this conversation today because the ARPA final rule gives cities and towns more flexibility to address some of the disparities that we all saw during the height of the COVID crisis. MEPC has been advocating for the state to really focus on investments in disproportionately impacted communities that were really bore the brunt of COVID-19. The very first ARPA spending bill, particularly that was passed by our state legislature, made really critical investments in public health, in climate resiliency, in housing, and in workforce and economic development. There's a little over another $2 billion that the legislature has left to allocate. And we're really eager to see the legislature continue to make really transformative investments that will really lead us to a strong, equitable, and resilient recovery across the entire Commonwealth. We also know how important it is that the legislature act quickly so that municipalities have some certainty about how they should be thinking about spending their local ARPA dollars. This final rule gives us a lot more clarity about how recovery dollars can be spent. And this conversation is really hoping to unpack what that final rule is, what's in there, what's different, and what questions still exist about ARPA. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Brendan. Please drop your questions into the chat. We did collect some in advance, and I'll be facilitating. Turn it over to Brendan.
Thank you, Lizzie. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. I am going to share my screen here, and then we can dive right in. All right. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Perfect. So we're going to talk through the final rule. As Lizzie alluded to, we otherwise have been operating under an interim final rule with use of the Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, which, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is the local stream of funding from the American Rescue Plan Act. The interim final rule was put into place in May of 2021 and was now superseded by the final rule that was released last month. So we're going to go through some of the key differences between the two, as well as other core aspects of both that should be kept in mind when thinking about how to utilize the funding. So the four key eligible use categories did not change. They are still public sector revenue, the revenue loss provision that we'll dive into in greater detail, the use to focus on the public health and economic response in your communities, the availability of the funding for premium pay for essential workers, and finally, the use of funding for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. What's notable here is, so the final rule is set to formally take effect on April 1st, 2022. However, Treasury has indicated that if a use of the funding that your community has already deployed the funding for complies with the final rule, but not the interim final rule, then Treasury is not going to take any action to enforce the difference between the two, essentially meaning that if your community does want to get a jump start on using the funding within the parameters of the final rule, you're able to do so in advance of April 1st without any penalty from Treasury. But otherwise, the interim final rule is still in effect up until that date. So as far as new features go, the real four notable or the four areas and the features that were updated within each of them. First, for public sector revenues, especially for the smaller communities, this is really of note. The standard allowance was set at $10 million, where up to $10 million worth of CLFRF funding can be claimed under the revenue loss provision and used for general government services. I'll talk more about that when we get to the slide, specifically focusing on revenue loss. But that's probably the headline change between the interim final rule and the final rule. Within public health and economic response, the eligible uses for impacted and disproportionately impacted communities were broadened, which is notable, especially because Treasury shifted away from the kind of strict focus on the qualified census tracts to give more flexibility for municipalities in identifying these populations. And also there are eligible uses now for reasonable proportional capital expenditures, and we'll discuss those. For premium pay, the span of essential workers who can receive premium pay without written justification was broadened. That's another measure to give municipalities flexibility if they choose to deploy the funds for premium pay. And notably for water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, dams and culverts, which otherwise were not eligible given that they didn't fit within the clean water or drinking water state revolving fund eligibility parameters, are now eligible. And broadband investments are broadened as well to focus on access, affordability, and reliability. So we will dive into the details of each of these key new features. Again, starting with revenue replacement and the creation of the standard allowance. So up to $10 million can be spent on general government services throughout the life of the program. And for most municipalities, I would expect that you would elect to take the $10 million standard allowance. Obviously, that's up to the discretion of your municipality. But for, I believe it's a little over 300 of the 351, the entirety of your coronavirus local fiscal recovery fund award is under $10 million, and therefore you can take up to the amount that you received, assuming it's under $10 million, within the standard allowance, and the ability to use the funding on general government services provides greater flexibility. Most spending, including pay-go capital projects, falls under general government services. So that really is a big change to provide municipalities with flexibility. If your municipality does not want to select the standard allowance, you must calculate revenue loss according to Treasury's formula. And the final rule details this as well. I will add in the chat at the end of the presentation links to the final rule and the overview document for those looking to get more information on these specifics. The final rule allows the calculation to be conducted on either a calendar year or a fiscal year basis. That's a change from the interim final rule. And the final rule increases the minimum growth adjustment to 5.2%. One piece that's worth noting, so while the government services definition provides wide flexibility for municipalities to use this funding on essentially any typical government service aside from pension deposits and some other prohibited uses that we'll discuss at the end of the presentation, you still must comply with all federal procurement, contracting, documentation, and audit requirements when deploying these funds under that standard allowance umbrella for revenue loss. And so this is something that's worth taking note of. The Office of the Inspector General has done a good job of compiling resources for spending ARPA funding in a compliant manner. The links here, I know Lizzie will circulate the deck. I would encourage you to check out the materials that they posted, and I know that they're hosting webinars themselves. So I'd encourage you to sign up for those as well. Moving on to response to the COVID-19 public health and economic impact. The final rule organizes the eligible public health response costs into 4 categories, which are COVID-19 mitigation and containment, medical expenses, behavioral health care, and preventing and responding to violence. And you can use or spend within this eligible use to respond to negative impact in your community by beneficiary, which can be deployed as assistance to households, assistance to small businesses, assistance to nonprofit, aid to tourism, travel, hospitality, and other impacted businesses within your community that fall under the public health and economic impact of the pandemic. And this is notable because it expands the presumption of impacted and disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And for the format for making eligibility determinations, you still need to identify a public health or economic impact to an individual or class. And this again is similar to the interim final rule, where you do need to document a negative economic impact in the event that you're providing assistance to small businesses or to households. They need to individually be able to document the impact of the pandemic. And then the municipality, in justifying the project, use of funding for the project, needs to note how this was a reasonably proportional response. So that has not changed much from the interim final rule. Additionally, and this is the piece we mentioned on capital expenditures, the capital expenses are allowable. However, they must also meet the related and reasonably proportional requirement. So what that means is, if your municipality, aside from using the standard allowance under the revenue loss provision, wants to spend on a capital expense in your community tied to either the public health or economic impacts of COVID, your community will need to produce written justification for any capital expense over $1 million regarding why this expenditure was appropriate given the circumstances, and what other alternatives were considered. So definitely there is a hurdle to cross when you are looking to spend this funding on any capital project, but the option is there. Premium pay. So for premium pay, eligible workers are those in critical infrastructure sectors, and essential work involves regular in-person interactions or physical handling of items handled by others. For those considering premium pay, those pieces of justification are what Treasury is looking for if you're in the process of determining who in your community should be eligible for premium pay. Additionally, premium pay must serve workers who earn at or below 150% of the state or county average wages, and are not exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime rules. This is not an absolute necessity. You could still provide written justification if you want to provide premium pay to workers who do not meet those requirements. But that is, Treasury does require municipalities, if they stray from these parameters, to provide written justification as to why this group was deserving of premium pay due to impacts cited above. And the pay itself can be awarded up to $13 per hour in installments or lump sums to hourly, part-time, or salaried non-hourly workers, and may not exceed $25,000 for any single worker during the life of the program. Finally, we'll discuss water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. As I cited earlier, the interim final rule tied eligibility of such projects to the clean water and drinking water revolving funds, state revolving funds. So I would, if you haven't already, I would recommend that you familiarize yourself with the eligibility parameters for those two programs. Essentially, what the interim final rule said what the final rule carries over is that if a project is eligible under those programs, it's an eligible use of this funding as well. But then they also expanded upon that scope of eligibility to now include lead remediation, stormwater infrastructure, notably culverts, residential wells, and certain dam and reservoir rehabilitation. So that, especially for municipalities, definitely broadens the scope of eligible projects within this eligible use category. And broadband, so recipients are still encouraged to invest in locations without reliable wireline service of at least 100 over 20 megabytes per second, I believe, speed. But broadly, and this is the expansion, municipalities are able to invest in locations where recipients have identified the need for additional investment. And so before, the focus was much more on providing broadband access up to a certain speed where it's documented that such access doesn't exist. Municipalities now can work a little more flexibly to identify need in various portions of their community for whatever reason to make the case for why broadband expansion in that specific area of your community was necessary. And it also allows for modernization of cybersecurity, which is another notable eligible use for municipalities. For restrictions on uses, these have not changed. It's still pension fund deposits are ineligible. Most notably, debt service payments are not eligible. So for those who had started a large capital project that may otherwise be eligible and are now paying off the debt service, you cannot use this funding to make debt service payments. That's also notable for those that are thinking about using the revenue replacement $10 million standard allowance. You have to structure payments as pay as you go. You can't borrow for a project up front and then pay off the debt service using this funding down the road. And you cannot replenish reserves and cannot use the funding for legal settlements. One point of clarification, I don't think this will really impact anybody, but it is worth noting that in the final rule, it's singled out that use of the funding may not undermine COVID-19 mitigation practices in line with CDC guidance and recommendations. And finally, for reporting, many of you may already be familiar with this. For the larger cities, the metropolitan cities and counties, you're required to submit quarterly reports. The first was due at the end of last month. And then you are also required to submit annual recovery plan performance reports, which are narratives summarizing the large projects that your community is using this funding to undertake and some of the goals with those projects, specifically with regards to equitable outcomes. For the NEUs, the non-entitlement units, which are the 300 or so smaller municipalities in the state, the barometer is right around 40,000 people. You would know whether or not you're a community. If you're a CDBG entitlement community, you're a metropolitan city. If not, you're an NEU or non-entitlement unit. You're only required to submit annual reports, and the first is due on April 30th. So I've linked to the reporting guidance here. I would encourage all of you to review that document if you have not already. But otherwise, that covers the presentation. I know that Heath Foley, who is the Assistant Secretary for Federal Funds, I believe he's joined us as well. And the two of us are happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Brendan. That was really helpful and informative. And we are, I'm getting a notice that my internet isn't working well. Can folks hear me? Yes, okay. Anyway, we have gotten some questions in the chat, which we've collected and we'll go through in a minute. I wanted to actually give Alex Train from the City of Chelsea an opportunity to talk briefly about some of the ways that Chelsea has made decisions about their local ARPA expenditures as well. And then we'll open it up for a full discussion and questions.
Great, thank you, Lizzie. I'm just gonna share my screen, so bear with me for just one moment, please.
You got it.
All right, great. Thanks, everyone. So good morning. My name's Alex. I'm the Director of Housing and Community Development with the City of Chelsea. For folks in the region, Chelsea is a densely populated environmental justice community situated north of Boston, and one of the communities that's been on the forefront of the pandemic, bearing a disproportionate impact due to underlying vulnerabilities and racial inequities. So throughout the pandemic, the city and our community-based partners have undertaken a robust COVID mitigation effort comprised of emergency programming, mental health services, public health initiatives, and housing and economic stability projects. So as these projects have been underway, we've tried to take a step back as we've received ARPA funds to chart a course for a community-driven process that will develop our local spending plan. So as part of this effort, we've assembled a 20-member community advisory committee comprised of 9 residents, 9 nonprofit leaders, and 2 city councilors. And the goal of this community advisory committee is to oversee the development of priorities, civic engagement, and ultimately an allocation plan that'll direct the city on how we should be spending these resources in the community. So originally we started this process back in December, where our city manager solicited applications from residents and community leaders to sit on the advisory committee. After we've convened the advisory committee, we went through an exercise where we strategized over their main goals and objectives. We've tried to do our best in understanding the kind of data needs and the data gaps in order to ensure that we're channeling resources to the committee so they can make informed decisions. And then we set out a civic engagement schedule that consisted of a range of focus group meetings with local community-based organizations, topic area focus groups that centered on our 6 distinct topic areas that I'll talk about in just a moment, a citywide survey, as well as community meetings and 10 to 15 key informant interviews with community leaders that are working on the ground. So as we kick this off, we briefed our community advisory committee on 6 main areas that they were most interested in. And these included affordable housing, small business assistance, workforce development, food security, mental and behavioral health, and environmental health. And within each of these 6 areas, we delved into a kind of snapshot of the existing conditions in Chelsea, as well as the vulnerabilities that existed in the community in each of these areas that made us so susceptible to the pandemic. Subsequently, we held 6 focus groups on each of these areas with between 10 and 15 participants. These participants ranged from local practitioners that were working in these domains, residents that expressed an interest in these areas, as well as outside sort of subject matter experts to bring sort of more objective voice to the process. Simultaneously, we held affinity group meetings with local community-based organizations, members of the faith community, as well as youth and other stakeholder groups that have been frequently marginalized in our planning processes. So we drew together all of the feedback that these groups provided us and relayed this to our community advisory committee in order to brief them on sort of the state of affairs with the community. Once these focus groups were concluded, we embarked on direct interviews with community leaders who specialize in each of the main areas of concentration, and also disseminated a citywide survey to seek input from residents that weren't able to join the focus groups, the affinity groups, or any of the other meetings to date. So right now we're looking at all of the results from the process thus far, including the survey results, the key themes that we've extracted from the focus groups, as well as the main sort of trends that we've seen come out of the community advisory committee meetings to date. Now the committee is embarking on their strategy development over the next month, and this will really entail developing key priorities and strategies in each of these 6 areas. So for instance, we had a meeting on Wednesday night relative to thinking through strategies on housing, workforce development, and the like. And what emerged was 4 to 6 priorities in each of the areas that were broad in general, but are going to be honed as the process goes on. So this became an exercise that we started out with the intention of not being overly prescriptive. So we started with collecting a lot of data in order to brief the committee and support them in informed decision making. But as we're inching towards strategy development and ultimately setting a budget, we're learning that we do have to set some parameters and contextualize a lot of this information for the participants. So in our upcoming meetings, we're planning on providing an overview of the different projects and programs that could financially support some of the priorities of the committee. So they can choose to use ARPA resources to either fill in the gaps or as an instrument to leverage local dollars in order to attract further state and federal resources. Once this whole exercise is complete, and this will occur probably in late April, early May, we expect the committee to set out a spending plan that they'll hand over to the city. And at that point, we'll start program development and program implementation while receiving guidance from the committee as these programs unfold. So overall, the process has been surprising for, I think, a couple of reasons. We were going into this from the municipal perspective, assuming that there were kind of concrete priorities and concrete goals that each stakeholder group and community-based organization could articulate and had. What's kind of coming out now as the process unfolds is that all of these areas are deeply important to a lot of our community partners, and being able to prioritize one area over the other is a daunting feat. The other kind of main unknown right now, relates to future state and federal ARPA resources that might be coming into the region. And so our committee members have expressed reluctance to program funding for specific uses, without having some more concrete certainty about what the state and the federal government could eventually support. But all in all, we see this process as a precursor to something larger, where we could eventually adopt this model in our municipal budgeting process, our capital improvement program, and other projects that the city undertakes going forward. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Lizzie. I'm happy to answer any questions on our process or experience today.
Thank you so much, Alex. I particularly love your flow chart. It looks very at home in many an MAPC document, so it was comforting to see. I actually want to open up with a question that's sort of asking both of you to kind of weigh in with your perspective. You both sort of mentioned the fact that there are these other federal dollars that are coming down. And I think one of the things, at least by my read on the final rule, is that cities and towns can think about how they might spend some of their local dollars to actually invest in some of these potentially other federal dollars, their local ARPA dollars, that is. So Brendan, I was hoping you could speak a little bit to, is that technically correct? Can cities and towns be using these their local ARPA dollars to invest, to try to take advantage of some of these discretionary federal opportunities? And then Alex, I would love to hear a little bit more about the conversations that you're having on the local level about how to think about potentially taking advantage of those dollars.
No, thanks, Lizzie. So the short answer is yes, but I do want to caveat that. So there is no restriction within the final rule that the coronavirus local fiscal recovery funds cannot be used for a local match toward another federal grant. So you can use these funding to provide whatever the local contribution may be. The only caveat is with the other end, depending on which federal grant you're applying for. If there's a restriction within that grant program that other federal funding cannot be used for the local match, that would be the only reason that you couldn't. Otherwise, as Lizzie mentioned, it's definitely a good opportunity for communities on that end.
Yeah, and I think from the local perspective, we've been hearing a lot on this, and we've been discussing a lot about the concept of leverage and how we can use these finite resources, and each community has a different amount, but how can we use these and multiply them into an even larger chunk of federal and state resources. So as our committee is developing strategies and setting their priorities, we've been working with them to identify ways that both program delivery can be supported, while some of that program delivery time could be used to pursue state and federal funding. So that could be something like a program manager spending a portion of their ARPA funded time on grant writing in major areas of concentration. Alternatively, that could look like using local funds in order to match state and federal grants to satisfy that matching requirement. But we're trying to approach this as sort of a catalyst, as opposed to simply using all these resources to meet immediate needs, which we are seeking to meet, and we are going to be using a portion of our ARPA funds to do so. But how do we really use these as kind of seed investments in order to spur something larger that could take advantage of more resources for the community?
Thanks so much, both of you. I think, we are very encouraged to hear both of those pieces. Obviously, at MAPC, we would love cities and towns to be working together to be trying to take advantage of some of those additional federal infrastructure dollars. And we're very eager to help our communities think through that piece. I think, similarly, I was very struck, both actually in the interim final rule and in the final rule, around the discussion around disproportionately impacted communities. I've been doing am just old enough to have been involved in ARA, the American Recovery Reinvestment Act, from 2008, 2009. And that language was new to me. This idea of investing and thinking about investing in disproportionately impacted communities. So, again, Brendan, on the technical side, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of those differences between the interim final rule and where we landed. And Alex, I'd love to just hear about how you're thinking about, just again, kind of drilling down specifically in some of those communities inside Chelsea.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. So I actually still have plenty of research to do on my own on this, so I'd encourage all of you to do the same. It's my understanding that in the interim final rule, the focus was more on the qualified census track, being the specific small geographic portions of your community that, due to census metrics, were considered to be, at higher risk of being disproportionately impacted, where, as everybody knows, working in local government, that's not the case, and impact was felt across the community depending on the demographics of anybody involved. And so it's my understanding that the shift is more towards those demographic identifiers, which would give communities more flexibility in identifying, pockets of your population that could be spread across the entire community, as opposed to just specific geographic regions, when creating programs intended to remedy these disproportionate impacts. So that's my understanding, and Heath can elaborate if he's here with us, is that there is more flexibility to allow municipalities to operate outside of any specific geographic constraints in the final rule, with the need still to justify why these groups that the program you may be offering is intended to help, why this program is helping.
So from Chelsea's perspective, one of our major goals, which is often contrary to a lot of federal funding requirements, is to, serve marginalized communities effectively by decreasing barriers to participation. And some of that is, decreasing the sort of administrative obstacles that residents or applicants to a program have to go through. So, a concrete example would be, an income verification process. We serve a community that is primarily cash-based. Going through an income verification process is rigorous, and it ends up deterring a lot of residents, particularly the most disenfranchised residents of Chelsea, from participating in our programs. So not only are we trying to remove those obstacles in our program implementation, but we're also trying to decrease the administrative burden on our own internal staff tasked with program delivery. And not only, do the staff appreciate this, but it's mostly because it saves time and it can allow them to then use that time to serve even more residents and manage additional programs. So I think having that type of flexibility is key. All at Chelsea, for instance, is disproportionately impacted, comprised by qualified census tracts. So we're looking forward to being able to use this funding in ways that we haven't been able to use CDBG and other resources.
Thanks, both of you, for those thoughtful answers. I think, and I know my internet isn't great, so I might turn off my camera, but we are definitely hearing this question from communities. And so I think it's helpful to hear how you're kind of thinking about it on your end. I want to actually turn to some nitty-gritty questions that we've gotten, which I think, Brendan, you might be able to move on kind of quickly. That elect to use the $10 million standard allowance.
So I caught some of that question, Lizzie. It seems like you were cutting out, but this is about.
Sorry, I can clarify if you can hear me.
Yes,
sure.
I can hear you.
Excellent. We'll keep the video off. If you could talk a little bit about the reporting requirements for municipalities that elect the $10 million standard allowance.
Sure. So I believe you still need to report by project. What's really notable is that before you had to report within one of the eligible use categories, and with the revenue replacement provision, you don't have to do that. It's considered a government service. I would recommend looking through the documents that Treasury has put in place for reporting. I know you still need to report on your costs, but it's my understanding that's the big difference, is that you're just kind of listing what the funding was spent on, as opposed to reporting within an eligible project category, and especially for the metropolitan cities, needing to provide that additional justification.
Great, thank you. One more again on kind of the nitty-gritty piece is, what are some of the federal procurement rules that cities and towns should be thinking about for the water and sewer construction projects?
This is where it's unfortunate I'm not nearly an expert on procurement. I can't really speak to those, unfortunately, but as I mentioned during the presentation, and I'll provide the link, the Inspector General's office is they're taking a pretty robust approach to addressing these questions and providing relevant materials. So I would refer you all to the website I linked in the presentation, but I can also look it up to provide a link in the chat as well. Generally speaking, I don't think there's any real notable differences than what typically applies through the state procurement process, but it's still worth looking into to just make sure that's, depending on the project, that any differences are being accounted for.
Great, I appreciate that. I know talking about procurement issues is like a deep well of its own area of needing expertise. So I appreciate your thoughts on this. Alex, I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about advice that you would give to communities that are looking to embark on a public process. And I should note, there are a number of communities within the MAPC region and across the Commonwealth, and a lot of our sister RPAs across the Commonwealth are helping communities with this process. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And then honestly, Brendan, any advice that you have for communities that are thinking about that public process? And I'm particularly interested in, how do we balance getting the money out the door quickly with this robust process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when we set out on this process, we aspired to facilitate a process that did not necessarily include all of the same folks that usually participate in local government. So every municipality has their kind of cast of common characters that show up to every public meeting, they go to the zoning board and the like, and they're great. They enrich the fabric of the community. But in our case, we included, a portion of the folks that usually participate, but we made it a concerted effort to entice residents and business owners that don't usually participate or are marginalized from participating by making meetings as accessible as possible in multiple languages, providing childcare and catering, as well as compensating resident and small business members for their time. So ultimately, we're providing sort of an hourly rate to all participants that are residents or small business owners in order to make sure that they're adequately compensated for the expertise that they bring to the table. And I would say, on the question of how to strike that balance between being deliberative and being sort of expeditious with rolling out funding to meet urgent needs, I think it's going to play out on a case-by-case basis with each community. Each community is experiencing hardship differently from the pandemic. Each community has different long-term strategic goals. In Chelsea's case, we had $40 million in ARPA funding that the city decided to utilize a portion of to make up for lost revenue that's being reinvested into capital projects and those physical improvements that enhance the quality of life of residents. And then a portion of it set aside for sort of this more long-term deliberative community development exercise. And that breakdown of funds, is going to vary community by community. But we spent a lot of time, consulting with our community leaders, speaking with residents, and seeking guidance from our city council to figure out how to balance that perfectly.
That's great. Thanks. Brendan, any thoughts here? Advice for community?
I appreciate the thoughtfulness that you all are putting into this process in Chelsea. I spend my free time as a city councilor in Beverly, and so I've gotten to see the other end of the process as a legislative stakeholder. And that's something that I've appreciated that, Beverly has tried to do as well, which is incorporate both input from legislative elected officials, but the community as a whole. I'll speak to some of the more technical sides of this just because I got a question on that topic. So I will provide links in the chat after this, but the Department of Revenue has outlined in the Division of Local Services within the Department of Revenue that from sheerly a technical perspective under, and I'm going to butcher the statute, so let me pull it up. I believe it's 4453A, which is the procurement statute governing the acceptance of federal grants. Under that statute, technically, all the municipality needs to do is through their legislative body accept the grant, and then the executive has the authority to utilize the funding in the manner that they see fit within the provisions of the grant. And so typically, if you have a grant for $500 to purchase a bike for the police department, there's never really much contention because it's a matter that, the grant is straightforward, it's for a clear purpose, and that's that. I know in many communities, given the size of the grant and the scope of what the funding can be spent on, legislative and other community stakeholders want to have a more tangible say in the process, and that's where I appreciate efforts like Chelsea. From the strictly legal perspective, the executive could allocate the funding as they see fit once the grant's been accepted, like any other federal grant. But I think it's a best practice, and I say that as a legislative stakeholder in my free time to work in the input from other representatives and particularly community stakeholders with regards to how the funding can most impactfully be invested in your community. One thing I'll add, I did receive one specific question on the revenue replacement piece, which is a good question. I would encourage you to reach out to the Division of Local Services as they're the experts on this, but the question was about how to accept the funding under the revenue replacement provision and whether it needs to be accepted. I'm going to mess this up, but if it's accepted in free cash, is that required to actually then deploy the funding for general government services? I do not believe that's the case. It is my understanding that you would accept the entirety of the grant and then deploy your standard allowance as one of the eligible uses, which would mean you'd still need to report on how the funding is ultimately spent. But there should be a completely separate federal grant account to use to account for this funding, as opposed to intermingling the funds under the revenue replacement umbrella with free cash or any other local dollars to make sure that you're still not infringing on the ineligible uses of pension fund deposits and some of the others that were outlined.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your thoughtful answers there. And then Brendan, for that clarification. I think that's really important for cities and towns as they're thinking about how to make sure that they don't run afoul of these rules. I did get one interesting question in the chat that I wanted to pose. I think probably Brendan, more for you. When do the measurable outcomes for projects need to occur? So if a community, for example, is investing in something around affordable housing, that takes a little time to make sure we're actually getting a benefit to particular communities. I think particularly in this instance, disproportionately impacted communities. And that, benefit might not actually occur until beyond the timeline. If communities can kind of show that they are essentially using these investments to move towards intended outcomes, is that the kind of thing that would fall under an eligible expense, or does the benefit to the individuals have to happen within the same time frame?
So it's my understanding that I do not believe the benefit needs to be documented in the same manner of the deployment of the funds, meaning that I would again recommend looking into this just because I have not yet had the time to really dive into detail. I don't think you need to document that, before 2024, the end of 2024, that the benefit has been met. More so what I know the Treasury is looking for, especially for the larger municipalities that have to submit recovery plan and performance reports, are goals for outcomes, so that when the funding is deployed, it's not just deployed under the umbrella of an investment in affordable housing, but there are metrics or some other more tangible outcomes that a community is working towards in deploying these fundings. And then I would recommend, as we work through the multi-year grant here, that if outcomes can be tracked tangibly, that's included within the larger narrative of the recovery plan and performance report. But the only requirement is listing tangible goals as opposed to actually measuring the outcomes as well within that few year period that the grant funding will be deployed. So that's the big focus. Focus on specific goals, track outcomes if you can, but really noting the goals is the requirement for the larger metropolitan cities and counties that will be submitting the recovery plan performance reports.
Thank you. That's great. I feel like the theme of your last two answers is sort of separate out the dollars and document. I feel like that is, yes, if we're boiling down the reporting side, that's kind of what it comes down to. One other question that we received in the chat, some communities are thinking about sub-granting some of their ARPA funds to local organizations. I'm hoping, Brendan, that you could speak a little bit to the technical aspects of this and how sub-granting is actually discussed in the final rule. And Alex, I'm wondering if this is something the city is considering. You have so many incredibly wonderful community-based organizations in Chelsea, many of which we have the privilege of working with at MAPC. So just wondering your thinking on that.
Yeah, I'll start. Thanks, Lizzie. So you can sub-grant to eligible organizations, nonprofits, or others in your community. They do have to make sure, so they have to spend within the same eligibility parameters. You as a municipality, as the direct recipient, could sub-grant and add any additional parameters. So if you wanted to make sure that the funding was focused on one of the eligible uses that this organization would be deploying the funding for, you could stipulate that in an agreement, sub-grantee agreement. And then there's still the reporting requirements. So you would have to make sure to keep tabs on how the funding was ultimately deployed within those eligible uses that you set with the sub-grantee and report that alongside either the annual report for the NEUs or the quarterly report for the metropolitan cities.
We expect that we'll be, after we have our allocation plan in hand, developing a series of programs that we will use to, compile and release requests for proposals to partner with local community-based organizations. So we don't generally provide direct subgrants to organizations, but we more frequently will competitively solicit proposals after we've designed a program and developed program delivery procedures. But with that said, I expect that the majority of our ARPA funding will ultimately filter through to contractors or community-based organizations, while a smaller fraction of it will be used for sort of internal program management and program delivery purposes.
That's great. Thank you so much. Brendan, I've gotten this question just like a handful of times. Would love your thoughts, and you might need to defer a little bit, is if a community has a question about whether a use is eligible, who do they ask? And since, not all of your colleagues are on the call, you're welcome to just, write a whole bunch of email addresses in the chat. That's not you if you don't want to answer those questions.
Please, I'm always happy to chime in, so don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll leave my email before we hop off. But what's worth noting, especially for those of you that work closely with us as we administered the Coronavirus Relief Fund municipal program, is that is a program where the state was the direct recipient and municipalities were the subrecipients. The Commonwealth had the responsibility for making eligibility determinations, because we as the direct recipients ultimately are responsible for how municipalities deployed the funding, and we report those expenses up to the U.S. Treasury. In this instance, municipalities have assumed the role of direct recipients of the funding for all of the coronavirus local fiscal recovery fund dollars that you received. And so while I'm happy to, similar to this webinar, chime in based on my understanding of the final rule and try to point you in the right direction, the Commonwealth can't make eligibility determinations. Municipalities are, they bear the brunt of that burden entirely. And so what that means is, as you're going through your decision-making process, I recommend reaching out to either your external auditor, town or city council or solicitor, and working with them to make final eligibility determinations. As I said, I'm always happy to answer emails and assist in any way that I can, but it will be very different where, the Federal Funds Office made explicit eligibility determinations for the Coronavirus Relief Fund municipal program. We will not be doing that going forward. Your municipality is the one that has to ultimately determine whether the project you're considering is an eligible use of the funding based on the guidelines.
Thanks for that. I really appreciate it and wanted to make sure to give you a chance to actually offer that back out to folks on the call. So last question before we close. I think a lot of us that are in this space have been doing a lot of reading about interesting ARPA investments across the country and across the state. I'd love to just hear something that you have read about or heard about that is really exciting to you, that either you'd love to kind of try to move in your own municipality, or that you hope the state would consider as well. Sort of favorite ARPA project, and then we'll close. Uh-oh. You're thinking too hard. You're too excited.
I'll chime in on this one. I'll toot the horn of my hometown of Beverly. They put funding towards a small business assistance grant program, which I know, just talking to business owners in our community, that was definitely appreciated. And that was one of the things that we heard from a lot of different local stakeholders, advocacy groups. We have an active Main Streets organization and otherwise that were really advocating for that. So I know that's how Beverly has deployed some of the funding. Otherwise, I would note, I know premium pay can be a sensitive topic to determine who, if anybody, should be getting premium pay in a community where, for most of you, you could probably make the case for all of your municipal employees and pretty much every other frontline employee. I'll reference Springfield, I know, has put together a premium pay program on a pretty large scale. Worcester is considering it. As far as smaller towns go, the town of Topsfield put together a premium pay program for their municipal employees. So I would recommend, no need to reinvent the wheel. It's worth, for those of you considering, to reach out to, for the bigger communities, Springfield, smaller town like Topsfield, and others that have put premium pay programs together, to hear how they went about it.
I'll throw out a couple. These aren't so much ones that we've read about, but ones that the community is discussing. We have been looking deeply into utilizing ARPA funding to promote energy resilience and the decarbonization of housing stock. So that includes everything from energy efficiency for low-income households, helping households transition over from gas to electric, and all of the weatherization that comes with that. Secondly, our committee right now is strategizing around different small business development initiatives. And one that we've been hearing about and thinking about as a city is, the establishment of some type of venture fund for minority-owned entrepreneurs that could provide, startup capital, potentially for an equity piece of the business, as well as ongoing technical assistance to help them grow into a small business. And then lastly, we've been reading a lot about, the topic of housing. I think ARPA is an excellent source of funding to accelerate, minority first generation home buying activity, whether that's through the development of affordable homeownership opportunities for home buyers of color, or to promote direct to home buyer programs, as well as programs that will mitigate and assist low moderate income tenants, such as rental guarantees, security deposit assistance, and other sort of smaller direct financial assistance programs that can help residents surmount major obstacles to housing stability.
That's great. Thank you so much. And since I put you on the spot, I'll put myself on the spot too. I can't choose a favorite inside the MAPC region because it's like picking amongst my favorite kids, but I'll offer an example that I heard in Metro Atlanta, where they put together a really incredible food security program by creating micro grocery stores in 6 of their lowest income high schools. And I thought that program was really an incredible program. And they offer fresh foods, and family members can also take advantage of it in addition to the students in the school. I thought it was really cool. So I just want to thank our panelists so much for your thoughts today. Brendan, as always, you and your colleagues at ANF have been so helpful to us as this process has unfolded. And Alex, we love working with Chelsea. I feel like your approach is so thoughtful here, and there's a lot for other communities to take away. I want to thank all of you for bearing with my Wi-Fi problems, and a special shout out to the MAPC team for putting this together. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And like I said, we'll send out a copy of the recording and see if we can also send out some answers to the questions that were raised today to send back out to folks. Thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.